G'day and welcome to what I hope will be an informative video on the subject of importing knives into Australia. What you see before you there is a seizure notice from the Australian Customs. I received this last year when I unfortunately had two Benchmade folding knives seized by Customs, and that's really what got me interested in this subject, I guess. Once you've lost some knives and some money and whatever, you tend to take a bit more of an interest. So hopefully with this video be able to give you guys some information, and hopefully that will prevent you guys having to get one of these. I've been thinking of making this video for a while, and I guess what's really prompted me is that just in the last week a YouTube friend not too far from me had a knife seized, a collectible knife, and it's going to be destroyed. And I thought, well, this is obviously still happening. There's still some misunderstandings out there about what can and can't be brought in, so I'll do my little bit to clarify it. Having said that, I need to put in a disclaimer up front. I am not a legal professional. Whilst I do in my work have some contact and dealings with legislation, I am not a lawyer, I am not a solicitor. Please take this advice for what it is. It's just my interpretation of what I've read and my experience. I'd advise you not to trust me. And what I mean by that is, do your own reading, do your own research, make up your own mind. I will provide links in this video to get you started on that process, and I certainly encourage you to do that. I'll give you the best information I can at this point in time, which is, where are we, October 2012. But again, I take no responsibility if you take my advice or misuse it and you fall foul of the law. Please do your own research. Knowledge is power. Right, before we get started, I'll move that away because I hate looking at it. I'm going to talk about Australia's system of government a little bit. Now, I'll be discussing these two documents initially. Now, see there the logo, that is Australian Customs and Border Protection Service, and above that you'll see Australian Government. That is because this Borders Protection comes under the Federal or the Commonwealth Government of Australia, in other words, the government of the entire country. So, we're going to be talking about importing knives. We are not going to be talking about the carry laws for knives, and I'll tell you why. Whilst importing comes under the federal government, and obviously is done through the agency of the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service, carry laws for knives and other weapons, and I don't like calling knives weapons, but that's how they're seen, unfortunately. To me they're tools, but let's use the lingo. Those types of law are written and enacted by the various state governments in this country. In my case, that's Queensland. And of course, they're enforced by the state police in the various states. So we will not be talking about carry laws in this video, and I need to really stress this point. Just because a knife is okay to bring in through customs, it's a permitted import, does not mean necessarily that you can carry that knife where you live. You need to, again, do the research on that. I will probably in the future do a video on the carry laws, at least in Queensland, which I'm very familiar with. I probably will not do it on the other states because I'm just basically not across them as much. But I will probably do one about the laws where I live. Alright, let's get into it. Import restrictions. All this is available on the net, these documents, and I will provide links for those. And this talks about import controls on bladed weapons, also some other martial arts goods. So we're going to run through some of this. Of particular interest to our knife people is the top section here, which talks about bladed weapons. Down below there's also some information on martial arts and sporting goods, which talks about things like nunchucks, crossbows, hand and foot claws, all kinds of weird and wonderful things. I'm going to concentrate purely on knives, bladed type implements, because that's really what we're interested in. I'll also be referring to this, which is an update. And on this column here, it talks about items that are or may be subject to control, and down here, bladed weapons. Again, I prefer to think of things as bladed tools, however, this is the crux of the problem, everything's a weapon. So, let's get into this, and what I'm going to do is show you some examples of knives which can be imported, and talk about some that can't. First, we'll touch on fixed blades. Now, fixed blade knives generally are okay to import, however, there are some exceptions. And we have some. It talks about daggers or similar devices, which are sharp-pointed, concealable, double-edged knives. Now, I don't have such a knife to show you. I do, however, have this old knife here. Now, whilst it is single-edged, it does have a serrated and what I guess you call a sharpened swedge on top. It's debatable whether this would, in this day and age, be a restricted import. My instinct is that it probably is, and I certainly would not try and import this knife in this day and age. If this knife had obviously a sharpened edge such as that all the way along the top, that is a restricted import, because then it's classified as a dagger. So if you're looking at knives and they're double-edged, or for that matter, in my opinion, even if they have a sharpened swedge, which is this portion here, I would not be attempting to import such a thing without a permit. Speaking of permits, we should probably touch on that very quickly. Any of these items here, it is in theory possible to import if you obtain a permit from your state police. It's what's called a B709B permit. My experience, certainly for the Queensland Police, is that it's pretty much a waste of time. If you have an item that Customs have declared as a restricted import, by default the Queensland Police at any rate will not give you such a permit. In the state where you live it may be different. Good luck on it, have a try, see how you go, but certainly if you're in Queensland, it doesn't hurt to ask, but you're probably wasting your time. Right, on to what they call ballistic knives. Again, don't have one of these to show you, I'd never even heard of them. It's a knife that discharges a blade as a projectile, so presumably there must be some kind of button and a spring blade in the handle, and it actually would fire the blade off. Quite a bizarre item, I can't think of why you want one. So that's a restricted import. Flip knives or similar devices. This is what caught me out last year, and hasn't changed since last year, but it talks here about knives that can be opened with gravity or centrifugal force and or pressure applied to a button, spring or device in or attached on the handle. So we're talking about auto opening knives, spring assisted knives. But they're also talking about knives that if you just flick the knife around, that it would open. Not dissimilar to that. Lucky I don't have one. The other thing that was added to that recently, and I'll just bring up this updated form and show you this, is when you look at the highlighted section there, this is crucially important, one-hand opening knives. So in other words, where it was open to some interpretation before as whether it was capable of being operated by centrifugal force, they've tightened that up, and now any folding knife which can be opened with one hand is restricted import. In other words, it will be seized. Keep that in mind. It's very, very important. Alright, back to fixed blades. There are some other restrictions on fixed blades. There are what they call trench knives down here. Now a trench knife, in this interpretation, is if I had, say, this knife here and it had a guard around here. You often see these on replica World War I and fighting knives, that type of thing, hence the name. It's normally like a steel guard to protect your fingers. Some have little spikes, they're like a knuckle duster. Restricted import. Do not attempt to bring such an item into this country. It talks here about also concealed knives, blade and spikes. I'm not sure exactly what that's all about. Star knives or similar devices. We're talking about shuriken, I dare say there, martial arts type knives. Sheath knives. That's a bit of a misleading term. What it talks about there is not a sheath knife as you and I know it, but a knife with a sheath that withdraws into the handle by gravity or centrifugal force. Again, I've never seen one. Presumably some sort of cover on the blade and you can push a button or something and it springs back. I've never seen such an item, but if you see one of those, don't bring it in. It talks about push knives, knives or a similar device that consists of a single or multi-edge blade or spike with a transverse handle. Now I don't have one of those either. I have a picture I got off the web, and that's a push knife. Now this particular example is in fact double-edged. However, as you just read there, even if this item was single-edged, it is irrelevant because it is classified as a push knife. So do not be trying to bring such an item in. Throwing blades, knives and axes. So you'll see those little throwing knife sets, don't try and bring those in. It talks about non-metallic and non-ceramic knives, blades and spikes. There are some knives that are completely non-metallic. Do not try and bring those in. I'm fairly certain there might be an exception for kitchen cutlery, ceramic knives, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Butterfly knives and similar devices. We all know what butterfly knives are. I don't have one on hand, but they are a restricted import. Do not attempt to import a butterfly knife. In fact, recently I had a message from one of my subscribers who had a butterfly comb, for want of a better term. Instead of a blade, it had a comb to do your hair with, and that was seized by Customs. I actually advised him he should email Customs and ask them under which part of the regulation that was put under. My suspicion is that it was considered that he could make a butterfly knife from that. And this is another important point. It's not just complete knives or whatever else that you're bringing in that is restricted. It is any parts that would obviously be used to make such a thing. So be wary of that as well. Alright, let's look at some knives. We've already decided that this one's probably a little bit dodgy to bring in, but fixed blades, as mentioned, are fine. And of course blade length is irrelevant. So that one's okay. That one's okay because they're all single edge. That one's okay. Even that big monster there, no problem. You can bring them all in. In fact, I'm fairly certain, with the exception of that one, these are all imported from overseas. Possibly not that one either. But anyway, the point is, if it's a fixed blade knife of any length, or a sword for that matter, and it's single edged, you won't have any kind of an issue bringing it in, or at least you shouldn't. Again, check and read the regulations for yourself. They do change, and at the risk of sort of going on, I don't want to be responsible if you get caught out. Folding knives is the big area where people get themselves into strife, and they're losing not only their knives but of course also their money, because the knives apparently get destroyed by customs. So you've done your day, you also get a letter giving you a warning, and I'm fairly certain your name's kept on a database somewhere. So what folding knives can't you bring? And again, anything that can be opened one-handed. Ontario Rat 1, can't bring those in. Spyderco Endura, no. Spyderco Delica, nope. Griptilian, no, they really don't like Benchmates, I tell you. Mini Griptilian, same thing, no. Even something as innocuous as this tiny little Blade Tech Ratel, by virtue of the fact that I can open that in one hand, can't have it. Alright, so don't try and bring in one hand opening folders. What can you bring in then in the way of folding knives? Well, there is one grey area at the moment, and there's been a bit of debate about Swiss Army knives such as this one. This is a one-hand Trekker. I know there's also an Army model. People have asked me in comments, can I import one of these? My response has been, probably not, because at the end of the day, whilst it's certainly not a fast opening knife, and in fact opens in one hand. Now, I think there's been people who've recently managed to get these things in, and good on them. There is fairly certain, I think it's safe to say, there's some inconsistencies in the way these regulations are applied by the individual inspectors who physically inspect your packages. So for me, I probably would not try and import that particular design knife, because there's probably at least an even money chance it'll go. You can, however, import folding knives that are two-hand opening. So these are a classic example. Obviously your Swiss Army knives, your conventional, more traditional types, they're strictly a two-hand opening knife. You can bring them in and there'll be no issue with that. Again, it's something like this Eco knife, strictly a two-hand opening knife. We've got our nail nick there, perfectly fine to import something like that. Traditional slip joints, got a couple of case knives to show you, fine, no problem. And what have we got there, a case canoe. Again, because they're two-hand opening, you can quite safely, at least at this point in time, bring these things in and you won't have any kind of issue with customs. Alright, now it should be stressed that this not only affects us here in Australia, potentially it could have an impact on, for example, someone overseas who might wish to send someone in Australia a gift of a knife. And for the sake of argument, let's say they wanted to send them a one-hand opening folding knife. I mean, that's terrific that they want to send such a thing, but it's not a good idea. The person sending will not be held accountable. The receiver here in Australia will be the person who gets in trouble for this. I recently had a message from a young lady, an Australian lass who's living in America. She was coming back here to get married to her American fiance, and wanted to buy him, I think it was a Spyderco Endura 4, very nice knife, and wanted to bring that into the country to give it to him on the wedding day. My advice to her was, don't do that, it will be seized in customs, you'll lose it, and best to leave it at home and give it to him when you get back. So that's the kind of implications these sort of rules have. I'd strongly advise not to attempt to import any potentially restricted item. Where you can, buy locally. Buy from some retailer here in Australia who has stock. Get on Google, do a search, Australia only, and you should be able to track those sort of retailers down. It's likely that over the coming time that'll become harder and harder to get one-hand opening folders. Again, all the links to this information will be in the description down below, and make sure you educate yourself as best you can. I'm reasonably happy to answer messages and comments and questions in relation to this. However, I'm not trying to set myself as up an expert. What I'd really prefer to see happen is that people get that knowledge and be able to make educated decisions for themselves. Also, if you wish, you can email customs with details of a knife make and model that you wish to import. You'd also want to consider a hyperlink picture, something like that, so they can have a look at it. But the reality is, if it's one-hand openable, they're not going to let that in. Alright guys, only one more thing I wanted to add. We spoke very briefly there about the process of trying to get a permit from your state police, in other words a B709B permit. Crucially important that you do that before making any knife purchase. There's no good doing it after you've bought the knife and it's already on its way. My understanding is if you were successful in having that permit issued, you would need to send a copy of that permit to the retailer overseas, who would then include that in the parcel to you, so when customs open it for inspection they can see that that permit's been issued. But certainly I wouldn't purchase any knife and then subsequently try and obtain the permit, because I really don't think there's much chance of anyone getting one. Alright, I hope that's been of some interest and some assistance to you guys. All the best, and hopefully this will help you from not getting any more knives seized. Bye for now.